Hello, everyone. As you guys are getting into the room here, my name is Sammy Anderson. I'm our marketing coordinator at Softcrylic. Welcome to our first digital analytics webinar this year so far, the Great Migration. We are talking all things of the recent Adobe migrations and transitions here. A couple of things to know: if you have any questions throughout the webinar, put it in the Q&A. Our panelists will either answer it directly or they will address it on the call, or we'll respond to you post-webinar as well. So no matter what question is going to get answered, whether that's in a follow-up blog or on the actual webinar, we will send out a recording to you guys after this is processed within the next week after the webinar is closed. So if you have to jump off, no worries. We're happy to have you for even a second. We are going to be doing a t-shirt giveaway. So it'll be a switchboard t-shirt, and I'll put a picture of it up in our chat. So the first 3 questions around today's topics that are in the Q&A, we will send you out a t-shirt. We can only ship to the US, unfortunately, but so keep those questions coming as they come to you. But first 3 people who participate today, you're going to get that t-shirt sent over to you, and I'll be following up with you about that. There you go, Nancy.
There we go, Nancy, first one already.
Again, if you have
That's
any,
awesome.
Reach out, info@softcrylic.com. Anything else you can always put in the Q&A as well. I'm going to pass it off to JP. Enjoy the presentation.
Okay, and one thing about the t-shirts, depending on the size, it may be this one that you're seeing, or it may be another one, a new one, based on an extension that we released called Switchboard. They're both awesome though. So yes, welcome everybody to the Great Migration. We're happy to be here. So I'm going to kick this off with the agenda, what we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to quickly introduce ourselves for those that don't know us. I'll take a moment to set the stage in terms of contextualizing what we're going to talk about. In terms of ACDL, the Web SDK, what that really is. We'll go deep dive into, deep dive as much as time will allow us, into each of those. Then we'll recap into why it's awesome, why we love this so much, and then give you some sort of recommended steps, which you may or may not do in this order. But it's everything that we think you would do in order to complete the Great Migration. So who are we? So I'm Jean-Paul. I go by Analytics Sensei. I lead the digital analytics practice. I handle everything from Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, all the main tag managers, data collection, reporting insights, etc. And I'm happy to be here. Hand it off to Jeff.
Hey everyone, Jeff Ogren. I'm on JP's team, a senior consultant in the digital analytics space. And most of my focus has been on the new AEP Edge Network platform. So I've been in both the early access program and the beta programs for it as well. So thanks for joining, everyone. Ray.
Yeah, hey, and I'm Ray. I'm a senior consultant with Softcrylic. I'm kind of one of our analytics architects and have my hands in just about everything. Today, I'll be talking about ACDL.
Awesome. And so to kick this off, DTM to launch migration. That is the first step in what we're calling the Great Migration. Judging by this timeline, unless there have been any last-minute updates to the timeline, we know it's been pushed a few times. If you haven't migrated to launch yet, if you're still in DTM, you may be having some trouble today because they went to sleep yesterday. So if you want to jump off the call and try to figure that out, go for it. We'll get you the recording. But then if you haven't and you need help, also contact us. But really, what we're going to talk about next or today is what comes next, right? And this is the Great Migration. And so I'm going to contextualize how we got to this point and then pass it on to Ray and Jeff. So if you think about where we are as an industry, I think of it as, from a data exposure perspective, how we've evolved. Right. And of course, there's many nuances to all this, but at a high level, we can think of from an approach perspective, what it was, and then from an Adobe, what that looked like. So, being in the industry for more than 10 years, I remember when we all implemented tags in line in the HTML, but that quickly evolved to the W3C standard data layer, which was awesome. It was a great way to organize data. In the CMS, it leveraged DOM browser events for page loads, and it was great for that. And a lot of people have used the digital data, right, object name, which is not really Adobe specific, but it's been adopted quite well. In tandem with that, a lot of you need to track things that happen after a page load. So custom event listeners was a way for many people to do that. It was great. It was solution agnostic, a little difficult to do sometimes, but it was what normally people would do to track non-page load events. You could also scrape, right, using jQuery and so on. But from an Adobe perspective, what we're really talking about here is that direct call satellite.track. That was the Adobe specific example. That was the Adobe answer to this. And then lastly, where we are today, we're talking about an event-driven data layer, right? And so everything above has evolved into this central repository that's used to track both page load and non-page load events. And when we talk about Adobe, this is what the Adobe Client Data Layer is. The recommended object name, Adobe Data Layer. And Ray will go into that a lot more deeper. So we're really talking about this down here. On the other side, we think of data collection using Adobe Analytics, right? How far have we come? Back in the day, we've had the S code and the H code. I'm actually not sure if they're different. Some people did refer to H code as its own thing. I think they're the same. But anyways, that unlocked the EVARs, the props, events, analytics as we know it, right? The base. After that came the app measurement code, which was amazing. It was lighter. It unlocked Experience Cloud ID Visitor service, more EVARs, and some modules that integrated analytics to Experience Cloud solutions. And now today, we have alloy.js, which is the library that's really wrapped in a launch extension called Web SDK. And Jeff will dig deep into what this is, and he'll show you a demo. So some of the things this unlocks is the edge network, XDM data schema, and server-side forwarding. So the new kids on the block are ACDL, Web SDK, XDM, and server-side. Again, just contextualizing, ACDL is what happens on your CMS. It's exposing data. And then data collection, it happens in AEP Launch. With the Web SDK, technically, you could do the Web SDK, or I should call it the alloy.js library in any TMS. But today we're going to focus on just Adobe Launch and how that enables you XDM on server side. So I hope that helps understand what we're talking about today. So with that, Ray, hand it off to you.
Yeah, so there are some really neat features with the ACDL. And so if you're not familiar, the ACDL is right now it's a GitHub repository that's managed, mostly contributed to by Adobe employees. And I think they'll probably be pushing it more and more as time goes on. There are some key improvements that make your life a lot easier, especially for developers or anyone looking to kind of push things towards a more robust modern web approach. The first one is that it's asynchronous, and I'll show you kind of a little example as to kind of what I mean by that. But it means, in short, that if you have multiple, say, API calls that are happening during page load, and you're pulling data from different from the responses of these different API calls, putting them together into a single data layer is makes it a lot easier, and you'll see why. So sort of tied to that resilience to timing issues, there's always will be, I think, and there is still an importance on timing, but it's kind of less critical and it's more flexible with how you want to handle it or how the developers want to handle it. Number 3, a single central repository. Kind of current state, a lot of folks are using kind of like you have your JavaScript data layer object, And then maybe for events, you're using a custom event or satellite.track, which I'm huge fans of. I've been pushing them for years, especially with some of the updates to direct calls. But it can be a little disjointing because you're telling the developers on one hand, here is your object for the data layer, and then, oh, but then there's also this function call that you need to make that seems relatively unrelated to the data layer. The ACDL sort of gives you the option to pull them both. So all your events or kind of standard page load data layer stuff all ends up in a single place, a single repository, you could say. Yeah, it's developer friendly for some of those reasons. It also just, even more so abstracts out any sort of kind of analytics world specific stuff. So, everything's obviously still just a JavaScript object, but there's no interaction for them with the satellite object, which sometimes can be a little confusing or sort of, make them wonder why, or, and it follows, it's basically a fancy array. So it is easy to interact with. Adobe has provided an extension to help with this. But there are, if anyone's savvy with code, you don't necessarily need to use it, but it does kind of simplify things. And this is the direction we think things are going. If anyone is familiar with Google Tag Manager or the Google Data Layer, this is going to look real familiar. They've been doing this for a very long time. There is some improvements, I think, but yeah, it's not so fresh in the wider scheme of things. It's just very new to Adobe. So let me jump into kind of a mini demo and walk you through what a page might look like that is using the Adobe Data Layer. So here's a HTML file. This is really stripped down. This is not how I'm recommending you actually implement this, but I wanted to get it all in one place so we don't have to jump around. So, in the head, we're loading all our helpers. There's launch. Maybe they're loading jQuery, anything else they might need. And then, early on, they I create this Adobe Data Layer window scoped object with the option in this situation, it would basically always be an empty array. And that's important. Interesting note here, right, is that we haven't actually loaded anything related to the ACDL. But then what's great, and this is what I meant by it's asynchronous, is we can go ahead and start interacting with it, even though the ACDL library hasn't loaded. See, the library itself, because there's no kind of magic, right? We still need to load a JavaScript library. It's very light, very fast. It's async. But to give this object or this array, it's sort of special sauce. We need to load this, and it can be loaded through Launch, and I'll show you that as well. But it's great because that now the developers, it's just an array, and we just start pushing stuff to it. So maybe developer one works on a particular feature that has an API call. That API call returns results describing maybe the user state or the page state. We push that info into the array. Developer two is working on it over here. Their feature, does something else, push all the data to it. Here's where there is a bit of timing that needs to be coordinated. You still need some way to tell Launch essentially that okay, the data layer is now fully populated, right? Because if everything's asynchronous, we need some sort of way to tell that. So that's something you would work with the site developers and whatever architecture they're working from to make that work. and then and then if you don't mind just ignoring this block for a second. So what happens is that all gets pushed into this array, and then the Adobe Client Data Layer JS itself loads. Here I have it at the bottom of the head. This is not, again, this is not how I would recommend doing this. You could actually put this at the end of the body if you're worried about page load time, but it is async, so we'll load asynchronously. And what's great is, and super handy, is this now, everything that was in the array when this file loads will then essentially get queued up and be executed. So that it'll go through, generate a consolidated data layer. So what's neat here is you don't have to worry about accidentally overwriting page.name with page.category, right? If you're not worried about overwriting the page object, this will actually merge it together, which is super handy. Then when this event essentially gets executed, which would actually be down here, then you can act on that data. Excuse me. So at that point, it's essentially an array with a simple object or a set of objects, but we can add some cool listeners here too. So here's an example of listening for any changes to the data layer, which is pretty can be kind of handy. So you would create a function here. I'm just calling it data layers change. And here is actually how you would get the computed state of the data layer. So in this case, it would be page.name equals hello world, page.category equals testing. And so you can kind of do something with it here. And that will execute whenever there's a change to the data layer. So you can do this all in pure code. They have a whole bunch. There's a couple other really helpful listener type events. Here's one to check for a particular event. So there's a distinction between the standard kind of object data and this kind of keyword of event. And that actually has a kind of specific usage. And so you could wait for that data layer complete event and then do something in your code. Of course, probably, I think it's important to understand the foundations of what's happening behind the scenes, but probably most folks will be doing it through Launch. So let's just take a quick look at what that might look like. So here is the Adobe Client Data Layer extension. You can choose your object name. It'll inject the library if it's not already present, which is handy, right? That's just one less thing to require the site devs to do. And then this extension will give you a few things. It will, let's take a look at, allow you to easily tie into listen for specific events. So that data layer complete event, I showed you how you can do that in code. This is how you would do it with the extension. So you just kind of tell it specific event. You can do all events or all data changes, which was the first example I showed. And then there's scoping here for future and past, which 9 times out of 10 you'll probably just want to do all. And then that will trigger it, and then boom, you can then kind of create data elements to pull values out of it, and treat it as you would both your data layer and your kind of event trigger system, a la direct call rules. So Yeah, it's pretty powerful without being too prescriptive. I think the only thing they really prescribe is they have a there's a event info object which allows you to pass data into associated with only the event you want it to. So by default, all the data that you push into the data layer will persist until the page reloads. Event info allows you to send data that won't persist. It essentially is only available for that event and then clears out. So
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think the ACDL is the only data layer that I'm aware of that has that dual capacity. You know, it's almost like persisting the data, similar to the GTM GA data layer, but then that event info is similar to sending a direct call with a payload.
right, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So it's pretty cool that you have that flexibility. Awesome. So Ray, you're done with ACDL, showing the coolness of it.
Yeah, I know Jeff's got a lot, so let's give him
Okay,
a chance.
Jeff, take it away. Let's go into.
Yeah, do you want to?
I'm going to share my
you want to
screen.
pull the slides? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So now that Ray's kind of done, I'll say the hardest part, right, of the implementation process, I want to move into the new data collection and data distribution stack, which you'll hear it referred to as AEP Web SDK or the AEP Edge Network. This is a really good overview slide from our friends at Adobe on kind of the new data collection framework. So what I'm going to focus today on, I'll do a live demo for everyone and take everyone through it. But really, it's how do we get data to the AEP Edge network? And then how does Adobe distribute it, right, to the Adobe destinations or even now non-Adobe destinations with Launch server-side forwarding. And the benefits of this new data collection methodology is it was a complete JavaScript library rewrite for all the Adobe products. So if you think about it, you used to have at measurement, you used to have your separate target libraries, you would have audience manager libraries. Right now, they're all consolidated into one JavaScript library, which is really beneficial, right? It also has its one Adobe beacon that gets sent up to the AEP Edge network, as well as one data stream and one server-side destination. So it's a lot cleaner and it's a little easier to scale all the different applications at Adobe. So what I'll move into is really our clients ask a lot about, hey, what does the new data collection workflow look like? So JP, if you want to go to the next slide, what I try to do is summarize what it kind of looks like. And with the demo I'm going to take you through today, there's really three different areas. There's going to be client-side launch, there's going to be server-side launch, and then there's going to be the AEP platform. So the first kind of step as we want to send data to the Edge network is really you're going to have to set up a schema. I'll dive into what the schema is. But essentially, you set up your schema, and then you pull it into your client-side launch property, where I have create XDM object. This could be created as a data element like you do today in Adobe Launch. The next piece of that is I want to show you guys how to map the ACDL to the XDM object. So you're going to have to start mapping different data elements to your XDM object from ACDL. And then very standard, you'll create rules to push the Web SDK out. And what you're doing is you're going to send the entire XDM object as a rule. So you could base it on either ACDL events that fire, or you could set it on core functionality of Launch like DOM loaded or page loaded, so forth. So that's the first kind of step. The second step, if you want to take it a step further, you can enable server-side forwarding, which is in a server-side launch property. So what you need to do for that is you'll need to set up an Edge configuration, and I'm going to go down to the bottom here, and you'll enable launch server-side. What you need to do from there is you'll create XDM paths. So you'll take that same schema and XDM path that you used, and you configure them as data elements within the launch property. And you'll use an application which is called Adobe Cloud Connector to enter the destination of your choosing. And then you'll map those data elements to key value pairs. And you could use either a GET request or a POST request to send the data off to your liking. So JP, if you want to go to the next slide, and then we'll hop into the demo. But that focus on getting data to AEP Edge Network, now Adobe makes it really easy to distribute the data to where you want it. And I'll show you this as well. We'll dive into it. But let's say you want to send the data to the AEP platform, right? Let's say you're on AEP, you want to build a data set. What you could do is build a data set. You could apply a schema, your same XDM schema that you brought in to launch, and you could send it to that data set. The next piece is, let's say you want to send it to a report suite in Adobe Analytics. So you could tell the Edge configuration, the report suites you want to send it to. And right now you could use processing rules to map the XDM to your analytics schema. So the analytics schema are things like props, EVARs, events, and so forth. And then Adobe will automatically forward that information to the report suite. And then finally, non-Adobe destinations via server-side forwarding. What you do is you make requests with key value pairs in your launch property, and you send it to basically a data collection endpoint. So with that, we'll hop into the demo, and I'll take you kind of through the end-to-end workflow of all of this. And the really cool thing with this live demo is we've actually implemented ACDL on softcrylic.com. So I want to take you through how we kind of leverage it. So. Okay. Cool. JP, can you see my screen? Okay. All right, sweet. All right, so the first part, what I talked about was really we need to set up a schema. So within the schema, you're going to go into Softcrylic beta here. We've already predefined a schema. And this is where you'll set up your schema. And right now we have an XDM experience event schema with some mix-ins. I highly recommend, we actually did a webinar back in September with Rudy Schumpert from Adobe, and I see Rudy's on. Thanks for joining. But I really recommend you watching that webinar because we dove deep into XDM, like way into the weeds, and we'll post a link out to that webinar. But it's really good if you want to start contextualizing what XDM and schemas are. But essentially, we have a bunch of different objects in this schema. I'm going to focus on the web one for this demo, but we have things like web interaction, the URL, the name. We have web page details. There are things like name, site section, so forth. So all kind of the out of the box stuff. You know, we're just basically Softcrylic's a content site right now. So not too much data collection that we're picking up. So once you have that schema set up in Adobe Experience Platform, you are going to move on to try to move this. Okay, cool. You are going to go to your client side launch property. So within the launch property, you have to bring that schema in, known as XDM. So what you will do is you will create a data element here. And this data element, for instance, I'm just calling it XDM. And with the AEP Web SDK extension, right, you will select this extension and you could pull in a data element type, which is called XDM object, for instance. And what it will do is pull back your sandbox that's tied to your company in a schema. So you could choose whatever schema. You could have multiple schemas if you wanted to. And what it does is it actually pulls in that same schema I was just looking at on the prior screen. So we have that. Now we need to map the ACDL right to this schema. So what you do is you will do that using data elements as well. So the really nice thing what you could do with the ACDL extension is I'm going to use page name, for example. And we're going to pull in this Adobe Client Data Layer extension and the data layer in the computed state, for instance. And all you do is reference the path. So on softcrylic.com, we have page name nested in a content object, essentially. So you'll save that as a data element. And what we will do is we'll go back into the XDM and start mapping it. So where I have page name is in the web object. I will go to web page details and push in the name, and you just pull in the actual data element that you set up. So it's pretty straightforward. There are some out of the box mappings too that Adobe has done already, so you won't need to map data elements, but for a lot of custom things, you'll need to map that essentially. So now that's done, you need to create a rule to tell Adobe Launch when to send this. This is a really cool thing with ACDL. is you could actually configure the events when the data layer is pushed. So what we have here is, this is set site-wide on softcrylic.com, but when the data layer is ready, we do DL-ready, and that's the event key. So if you think about it, you could have specific event keys for like search interaction, link clicks, so forth. You could get really into the weeds with it. But for this is just a global page load. We're going to fire it off when the event key is ready. So that's saying, hey, Web SDK, fire when that happens. And within the actual Web SDK extension, all you need to do is pull in this XDM data element into this XDM data, and it will actually send. So what we'll do is I will move here to the actual page. And this was actually the webinar I was referencing with Rudy. So what you do here is when I refresh the page, the XDM is actually going to fire from the client side browser here. And it's
Hey, Jeff, can you zoom in a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Let's try. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. So what you have, we were just talking about page name. So we map the page name to the web page details in the name object. So this is pulling the information into the XDM schema, and it's going to be the same. It's going to be the same mapping that we have it into the Adobe Client Data Layer that is here on our website. And this was the event I was talking about, DL.ready. So anytime Adobe Launch sees that, it's going to send the Web SDK. So what you have to do now is that sends it to the edge network. The really cool thing, what we could do is we could open up, I'm going to go back here into our edge configurations. So now our data is basically at the edge. We could tell Adobe where to send it now, right? So there's this concept called edge configurations, which are fairly new, and you'll have different environments and so forth. But what I'm going to select is my development environment, because that's where I have it. And this is where you configure where you want your XDM sent, essentially. So for here, I have it sending to a test report suite in Adobe Analytics. I also have it sending to the Adobe Experience Cloud platform to my event data set. And then I've enabled launch server side as well. And I'll take you through that example next. But the really cool thing with this is using Adobe's new debugger here. And let me refresh the page. Is you can see where it's sending your data off. So if I actually need to go to logs, edge, and it's starting edge trace. So this is telling you all the information that happens once it's received at the edge network. Right now, I believe this is the only way. I think they're starting an integration with Postman. I may be wrong on that, but right now you could use this debugger, and it's actually it's really intuitive. But what is happening now is it's going to pull back all the information I have at the edge network. And of course, you have to be authenticated into your company to pull this information back, because it's not at the client side browser. But what it will tell you is requests received by the edge. And here in my edge configuration, and I'll zoom in a little bit, it's telling me that it's sending data to that actual report suite here. And what you could do is you could look at all the data that is getting pushed to that report suite. And it's basically set, the best way to think about it, if you use processing rules a lot, and if you use context data a lot, this will show up in your context data processing suite, processing rules application. So let's say you needed a map channel to site section, or I'm thinking to an EVAR, for instance, you would do that mapping based on these key value pairs, essentially, as the processing rule that gets set. So that's a pretty cool functionality, the edge trace. Oops, zoomed in a little too much. So the next piece of this is going to be server-side forwarding. I want to take you through while we have about 5 minutes. So for server-side forwarding, oh, sorry. Before I move to server-side forwarding, I did want to show you one more thing. So we sent data to Adobe Analytics, but we also sent it to AEP, which is pretty cool, based on a data set that I set up. So what we could come in here is we could go into AEP and look at our data sets. And what I did, if you remember that screen in the edge configuration, you could see I was sending it to this Softcrylic beta data set. So this is a data set in AEP, if you do have access to AEP. But what you could do is we could preview this data set. This is just like the last network call that happened on our site for this. But essentially what you do is it flattens your XDM schema, which is really cool. And this is like the raw level log data that you could essentially query. But what you could see is it's pulling in our schema already that we created and mapped in Launch. So you have things like the DL ready, the view name, the blog name, all this information that you could use, for raw level data analysis. So it's pretty cool how it's sending the same exact schema to AEP as well. Okay, so server-side forwarding. There is actually a server-side configuration that is done when you have access to server-side forwarding. And this actually kind of stays in sync between your client-side property and server-side property. And if you think about it, with server-side, it's sending data directly from the edge network. So we have to configure XDM translations to send to like third parties. So what we did here is, this is just an example of one I set up, but let's say we want to send identity, an ACDL event, and a blog page name to a third-party marketing partner. What you would do is you would come into here, and as part of the core extension, you would just actually create a data element, and you have your XDM path. So in the XDM path, everything starts with this arc.nomenclature, and this is the event, this is the XDM, and this is the path, so blog name. So again, you have to do another mapping exercise, but it's fairly straightforward because you already have that in your XDM. So you would create that data element here. And what you would do is you now have to create a rule. So they're essentially called fetch calls with this Adobe Cloud Connector extension that is available as part of server side. And the first step is you need to set up an endpoint, and you could choose your request method. So the most popular, of course, are going to be get and post methods. But this endpoint I hear for testing is PipeDream. It's basically like a webhook application. And what you do is you have key value pairs, essentially, like any third-party marketing pixel collects, and you map your key value pairs based on the data elements you already have, which is pretty cool. And then within that rule, you tell it when to send. For this, I'm just having it send with every DL.ready event, but here you could add conditions. Let's say you don't want it to send on certain pages or certain events, you could add those conditions here. So the debugging this is it's not that tricky, but you will have to use the Adobe Experience Cloud Debugger. But what happens is using that same edge trace that I was just talking about, here I'll try to zoom in a little bit. What you could do is you could actually see, based on the edge, it picked up that rule I set up in the server-side launch property using this cloud connector extension. And then you could see it sent the data that I just refreshed. So the ID with an ID, the event DL.ready, and the blog, the actual blog name, it sent that off to where I told it to. So this is pretty cool. You could actually, Adobe kind of becomes your data clean room, and you could actually, use this to govern your data that's going out to third parties. Another cool piece of this is, let's say you want to send the entire XDM object to an internal data warehouse or outside environments like Google BigQuery, AWS, right? You could send that entire XDM object fairly easily in one kind of single request, which adds a lot of power to the server-side forwarding piece to it. But what it kind of looks like is, here is one of my requests that I actually just made. This is PipeDream, so this is just collecting the information I'm sending it to. But basically, this is the ID I sent, this is the event, the DL.ready, and this is the blog view. So pretty powerful stuff with server-side forwarding. And I hope I answered the question in the chat, the power of it. But that's kind of it for the data collection stack. The new data collection stack. I know it's kind of a lot, but there's some really neat functionality that's coming out. I highly recommend too. Adobe does have public updates on GitHub, and we'll post this on the blog site where you could get this. But this is just kind of the evolution of the new AEP Edge network. And as they start adding more functionality, you could kind of keep up with it. This is a really nice site to keep up with it. So, but we'll send that out to everyone after this call. But with that, JP, I'll hand it back to you to close us out.
All right. Awesome. Thanks,
And-
Jeff.
Sorry, real quick. And Jeff, you don't have to use the server-side forwarding though, right? You could use.
Exactly. You don't have to. I mean, that is there is an additional cost to use server-side forwarding. So I'll say it is a little confusing. There's server-side launch, which is basically a CNAME hosted tag manager solution. So like if you think about it, instead of calling assets.launch.com, I forget what it is now, but you could call like assets.softcrylic.com, right? So you would have a first party launch implementation. Server-side forwarding is a completely separate piece, and that's basically sending data to non-Adobe destinations. So I hope that kind of helps clarify.
Cool. Yeah, and I actually, I'm going to go over why this is all awesome. Why everything together we really like. And one of the examples, in fact, I'm just going to jump into it right now. It actually doesn't use server-side forwarding only because I didn't have access to a server-side launch instance. But what I want to show you here is grabbing everything that Jeff and Ray have spoken about and put it together into a pretty interesting example, which I think it's a little adventurous. We're going to be going to the Google merchandise store and grabbing the data from their event-driven data layer using the ACDL extension, and then passing that Google data to Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics, with a single property. And so that's what I've set up here. This is my launch. I have my rule to send data, product detail view to both Adobe and GA, and I'm leveraging an event that is available in that data layer. I set up my data elements using the ACDL extension, and then I created my XDM object as well. And then I brought in my extensions GA, Web SDK, Client Data Layer, and Core. So those are all the things I needed to do. I'm not going to go through all the setups because Jeff did that. But essentially, what this will allow us to do, and Ray touched on this earlier. ACDL is very similar to the GTM GA data layer because they're both event driven, and so that is, in our opinion, a really good. You can really easily migrate to utilizing ACDL, because if you already have an event driven data layer like GA, because it uses the same approach. And so in this case, you'll see this is what the data layer looks like on the regular Google Merchandise Product Detail View. I'm going to target grabbing this product, and in order to do all this, I need to use this extension, Switchboard. It's the one we developed, and essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the Google Tag Manager to the Adobe property that I was showing you earlier. All right, and so I'm going to turn that on. I also need to turn on this extension to disable content security policy, because of the whole same site and the privacy, changes that browsers are doing. I can disable it just here in my local, right? And so if I refresh this, we're now going to see the Adobe Client Data Layer and all of the debugging steps for launch are available because we're switching from GTM to launch. If I look at the data layer, you'll see it's very clean now. This has to do with because Google, it seems they inject a lot of their data layer through GTM, which is not necessarily a practice that we would recommend. But anyways, you can see here, part of what they do emit on the application side or the CMS. If you think about that data exposure example I gave earlier, we are able to capture this. And so then I'm leveraging this event down here. If you look at my network tab, you'll see that I have my edge triggered, or my edge beacon triggered. You'll see my events. You'll see the XDM. In my case, I configured a commerce mixin through AEP. And so then I'm listening for product list items. I mapped these variables, the SKU and the name. And then I also mapped the category down here and the SKU as well. And at the same time, I have my own Google Analytics property here. This is not one controlled by Google, it's my own private one. And so I can see that there's an event for product detail view going out as well for the Google phone, Stand Bamboo. And so if I go to GA, I can see in real time that product detail view was captured for that product. And in Adobe Analytics, I also see that this was all sent using the XDM. Back to what Jeff was saying, the product variable is something that the XDM automatically maps. If we go down here into the XDM, there's no product variable, right? There's no s.products, but that's because the XDM will do that automatically for you based on this schema. And then I also captured 2 more custom variables. These are props just so that they show up in the real-time report, but I'm mapping these with processing rules. So I'm grabbing those additional data layer, XDM variables, mapping them to the right properties, the right variables, and then I'm getting that data. And so we think this is awesome because what this will allow you to do is have one property and just standardize the way you collect data and send it off to as many vendors as you want. And then of course with Switchboard we were able to do that on the Google Merchandise Store, which I'm sure they'll find interesting. So let's go into the takeaways, right? Like, why is all of this awesome? From an ACDL standpoint, we think it allows you to now start thinking, if you have GTM, to not only DTM to launch, but GTM to launch. And so, like I showed you, you can leverage most of the existing event-driven data layer used by GA GTM. We run into a lot of clients that use both, and so now you don't no longer have to maintain both. And then it has a very quote-unquote native-like SPA support because everything is event-driven, right? Nothing from an ACDL standpoint, it's disconnected from the DOM, events from the browser. On the Web SDK side, again, because everything is a single beacon, the library itself was redone from the ground up. Performance is greatly improved. I mean, Launch was already faster than all the other TMSs, but in this case, it's even quicker with the Web SDK. And then, of course, utilizing a common schema across all your products from an Adobe perspective, and then eventually into AEP, which opens a whole new set of possibilities, right? From a server-side forwarding standpoint, you can leverage that XDM schema and send to any data source that you have either internally or that data repository, you have either internally or externally, which, like Jeff said, Adobe now starts acting as like that data clean room where you can forward all your data to any destination, which eventually we think will probably replace marketing pixels. We'll see how it all pans out, but with the death of the third-party cookie, we think that all these trends are kind of converging together, and using ACDL, Web SDK, and AEP Launch server side is sort of like the combined approach to tackle all that. So how does this great migration look like? This is why we call it the Great Migration. Because as you can see, there are a lot of things to consider. These are how we recommend thinking about this. Obviously, depending on your individual use cases, you don't have to do all of them, or you can time them in different sequence. But if you think about it, the first step is migrating, if you're on DTM, to Launch, which you should already be in. One quick update that Rudy did share on the chat is that the deadline was extended by one more week until April 20th. So if you haven't migrated to Launch yet, there's still time. Then thinking about migrating your data exposure, your data layers and all of that into the ACDL. One important note here is ACDL is actually it's like a native module of Experience Manager. So it comes from that team. However, it's still CMS agnostic. Like we're using it on our website. We're not an AEM. We're actually on WordPress. And so we still use it, which is great. It's very agnostic and it's an event-driven data layer. If you have GA, GTM, migrate all that to Launch, migrate your data collection to the Web SDK and your data distribution to the XDM because it standardizes everything. And then if you think about your solutions, we think migrating first your third-party tags to Web SDK, XDM, and Launch server-side forwarding, I mean. That's probably the path of least resistance, followed by analytics. And then finally, your personalization tools, migrating that to Web SDK. We really want you to think about this a little bit more, thoroughly when you think about personalization tools and Web SDK. I'm talking about Target, obviously, because depending on the use cases that you currently do, some of them are not covered, some of them are. We know Adobe is tirelessly working to make that, make sure all your use cases are, or all the common use cases are covered with the Web SDK or AEP, right? But, something to think about, it's not a simple thing to just migrate everything to Web SDK, right? So with all that, that's the great migration. Yeah, go ahead.
I do want one thing to point, like on the Web SDK too, and we're taking this approach with a few clients, right? You could run app measurement in the Web SDK in parallel. You just don't have to send the Web SDK data, right? The XDM to your Adobe report suite. So if it's a little, it all depends on your use cases, right? But it could be a lot of migration work. So our thought behind this is you could get your hands dirty with Web SDK, right? Just on your website and leverage it for third-party marketing tags and server-side forwarding. So there's possibilities to run those in parallel, which is a pretty cool use case. So
yeah,
just wanted to add
exactly.
that.
And just to bring that, in terms of visualizing, when you're configuring your edge configurations, you can set all those things, whether you want Adobe, Audience Manager, AEP, and Target and service, that's where you configure all that. So yeah, you can definitely run things in parallel. So that brings us to the end. We have 5 more minutes left, and we have a couple more questions that haven't been answered in the, in the chat. So I see Nancy Delay. Thank you. You're welcome. And then there's another question. If I have an existing Adobe Analytics and Target setup and we want to migrate using Web SDK, does that imply a change of Adobe SKU, additional cost, contract changes to get access to the edge in Launch and AEP to create schemas? So I actually don't, Jeff, do you know about this one?
Yeah, I would say reach out to your Adobe client rep first, but our understanding is if you wanted to migrate to the Web SDK, there is no additional charge for that. I know it's a little confusing because for the Web SDK, you have to actually set up a schema within the AEP platform. So from our understanding is if you want to migrate to Web SDK, you need to probably talk to Adobe Client Care or your Adobe rep to have them provision you access to AEP just in the schema creation piece of it.
Yeah, true. And some of the documentation does say that, if you do enable the Web SDK, they will, enable that piece where that Jeff was showing where you set up your schemas. But yeah, I think the best.
Yeah, and Steven just responded from Adobe and he said Web SDKs are free and you get access to AEP XDM creation. So
there you go. Thank you, Steve. The presentation will be shared via the video. We're going to upload this video on YouTube and then do a recap blog post. So we'll share it that way. And then one clarification here from Rudy, the only extra charge is if you use launch server-side forwarding to send data to non-Adobe endpoints. And that has to do with just, when you do server-side forwarding, you're utilizing a cloud service, right, to do that. And so it's, as we understand it, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's not Adobe that is really charging you for that. It's more of like the architecture necessitates it, right? And so that it doesn't matter if it's launch server side or GTM server side or Telium server side. They all need to charge you for this because it's part of what the technology, entails. So yeah, 2 more minutes. Any other questions? Well, if you haven't already, please fill in the polls. We're going to leave that open, for the last 2 more minutes of the webinar. But, thank you for joining. We hope this was very valuable. For those of you that did ask questions, Sammy will reach out and try to coordinate sending a t-shirt to you. It might be this one, or it might be a switchboard t-shirt, which is equally, if not more funny. So yeah, any further closing statements from you guys, Jeff, Ray?
I just reach out if you have questions on any of this. We're always here. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining, guys. Have a good one.